last week was the 31st anniversary of the death of Frank Herbert, the author and creator, the visionary behind the Dune series of fantasy sci-fi novels. He also authored other books. Not a lot of people know that. And there's actually one that I started, which is the Desardi Experiment, which I've heard is good. But he's primarily known for the Dune series because the Dune series was a series of 6 books which spanned basically, I mean, I think the publication years were 20 years. And this is what's great about the guy, is that it's my favorite series of books, fictional books. But he didn't just do one and then decide the next year he's going to do another, or churn them out really quickly, or do 50 books. He really took as much time as each one needed and allowed ideas to percolate, to ferment, to appear to him, to inform him by reflection on the past books and novels and other things he learned in his life. And so this 6-book series was the culmination to some degree of a man's career, a man's life, his philosophy, his way of thinking about the world. And as such, it's not really a surprise when I think about it now that it's such a fantastic series and that I hold it so highly and in such esteem, because it's a series that was more than just a typical commercial fantasy series. It's something that encapsulates a man's whole thinking and his life experiences. So for me, Dune is the best fictional series that I've ever read. I've gone back to it many times. It's fantastic. I think it blows stuff like Lord of the Rings, which admittedly is certainly very good, and A Song of Ice and Fire, or Game of Thrones, as people know based on the TV show. I think it blows these out of the water, quite frankly. I mean, in terms of, they share some similarities, some very simple ones, but in each area, for my money, it's better. More imaginative, more creative. I love the backstory, the world created more. I find less characters that I feel throwaway or unnecessary or uninteresting than some of those series. And by the way, those are 2 fantastic series, particularly A Song of Ice and Fire is amazing. I think it really drops off after the first few books, but the first 2 absolutely must be read. Lord of the Rings, it's very much of its time, of its period, and it's an old type of book, but it certainly has a lot of qualities to it. And yeah, you have to be quite into the world, I guess, to enjoy some of the, like, I was a big fan of some of the singing and some of the background details, but the epic nature that does somehow summon some of that up and conjure up and create it and put the planks in place to create that epic cathedral that is Lord of the Rings, the trilogy. Now, some of the themes that are dealt with in Dune, I mean, a primary preoccupation is the notion of power, what power means, what it means to exert power over others on a personal relationship level, and then on societal level, and then civilization to civilization, and a meditation as a result on what that means and how power is wielded and how different philosophies on power would interact. It's very much also about ideology, about having a set of principles and precepts and a tradition and tenets that you dedicate yourself, and then when you take that to the nth degree, when you extrapolate as far as it can go, maybe over thousands of years, where does that get you? What is that going to actually yield ultimately? And what is that nature of committing to an ideology going to do to your character and your person? The human dynamics of how civilization operates and mirrors personal relationships is a key topic. A massive one in terms of the concept of the central characters of the books and some of the powers they have and how they think about the world is the notion of free will and freedom, and what does that actually mean? And does it mean the choice to make a mistake? Does it mean making the best choices? Like, how much are we even able to do these things? How much would even prescience, seeing the future, allow you to change things or to make what seemed like a correct choice? And should you even do that? Like, these are all topics and themes that are sometimes incredibly present. They're overtly stated, and at other times are seething, a bubbling away under the surface within this epic sci-fi space opera. I mean, it's not even, these terms don't even do it justice because there's so much pulp material out there that uses this terminology, but it's these books contain so much depth and so many levels to them. And also, when you talk about prescience, there's also this key concept that is always a kind of a refrain, which is, are we trapped by these paths? If we had prescience and we thought we knew the right route, would that in some way itself trap us and then become a self-fulfilling prophecy in any way? And the good thing is, yes, there are certain conclusions drawn by the fact the story and characters go certain ways, but I don't think there ever is a final statement on these things, because how could there be, right? Yes, within the fictional universe, he has to come up with something to say and some decision has to be made at some point, but that doesn't mean the question, the conversation is over. And that's why these books endure and have so much to them, where you can go back and reread them and immerse yourself into something more than just the plot points and the character development. So as I go through the 6 books, which I've read all 6, I'm not going to give any spoilers. I'm going to purposely not hit certain plot points and give away even the premise of the books entirely. But I'm going to hit some of the key aspects, and I think still be able to explain and outline why it's a fantastic series, because it has one flaw as a series, in my opinion, which is it's a fantastic, and once you've read it all, you can appreciate all the books, but the order that the books go in and the way the story is set up and unfolds means that I think a lot of people won't get to some of the later books because they'll think by what happens at certain points in time that it's going to be more like that, and it's degenerated into something that they don't want, or changed into something, transitioned into a different type of a story, and therefore they won't want to continue. But actually it keeps on transitioning and changing book to book, and therefore if they stick with it, it's certainly, the payoff is worth it, in my opinion. So first and foremost, the first book, Dune, published 1965. This book can absolutely be viewed as a standalone. It could be read just on its own if you want to read one book. It is a fantastic single book, self-contained, and it is one of the best ever fantasy fiction sci-fi stories that is archetypal. This really plays into that whole the hero with 1,000 faces that Joseph Campbell explored in his work and outlined as this archetypal story and mythological theme playing out in this procession of events. It certainly was within that wheelhouse. And as such, especially, particularly, I can obviously speak in this sense myself, to young men, this is going to be incredibly enticing, incredibly satisfying work to read, because of the ideas contained and even the simple notions of what happens in the story and who the people are initially who are presented in some of the earlier books. This is really appealing stuff to that sort of person, very attractive intellectually and in terms of entertainment, enjoying a story. Yes, there's an extent to which this first book is kind of a metaphor for some of the Middle Eastern power dynamics that we have in our world and the conflicts that have taken place there, because obviously what a lot of people don't know with the modern world we live in, of wars within the Middle East, especially with Western forces intervening and some of the terrorism and stuff, what a lot of people do not know is that long before all of that, a lot of the things within the Middle East anyway were informed by the intervention of Western forces anyway. We're talking 19th century, early 20th century, drawing up the map, dividing it up, taking part in who rules what and replacing certain power parties. And so a lot of it's alluding to some of that and building out from some of that and taking its inspiration and its cues from some of that. Because you have to remember, 1965, that is pre the Soviet-Afghan war with the Mujahideen and all those guys. This is way before the Iraq wars, even the Iraq war of the 90s. So interestingly enough, some of what it takes when it takes the inspiration and then goes further with those plot points actually ends up hinting. It actually ends up having its own prescience, because it's about understanding the nature of human dynamics and cultural dynamics and how they interact and clash at times. It actually ends up being quite prescient and hinting towards what's happened now with global terrorism, etc. When you think of some of the aspects of some of the characters within it and some of the antagonistic forces within the novel. Now, the second book, this is where it starts to get tricky. Dune Messiah came out in 1969, 4 years after the original. And the problem is, this book, if you enjoy the political intrigue, the Lord Baelish, the Lannisters, Tyrion Lannister, that aspect of A Song of Ice and Fire, this is the book for you. This is a book all about that. That's primarily the themes it is preoccupied about. It takes some of the themes from before, develops them further, and then some of them will be taken by other books to different nth degrees, different ends, down different golden paths, as it were. But this is the book that really sets up a lot of that and becomes more of a political intrigue type book and less of just a standard sci-fi novel or a thriller or drama in that particular sense. And so it's very subtle, it's very nuanced, it's quite slow moving. You get a lot of different characters that don't have a lot necessarily always to do with the first book, that are to represent other things. And so the problem is, it is good, but it's in a very different way good. And so I think some people who liked the first book, Dune, come to the second one, they're like, this isn't really anything like that. I'm not really into this. Like, I'm just going to quit at this point. And the big problem with that is, like, fine if they don't like that book. But the big problem is that you really need to read that book to get to the third one, which is already quite different. And then you have to read those to get to the fourth one. And the fourth one is my favorite. The fourth one, for me, is the pinnacle of the series, combines everything that's great about the series, and is like a masterwork of literary fiction. And unfortunately, it's number 4. So everyone's going to read the first one, but then you've got to read 2 more. But I will say, for everyone who I've ever recommended on a personal level to do so, who was then read the second and third books and got to the fourth one, they all told me the payoff was worth it. And they're glad, like I told them, just stick with it, like get through them. And so I'll just say, if you like the first one, maybe that's something to bear in mind. Dune Messiah is a book that deals with big questions in terms of power, in terms of religious zeal, in terms of starting to really deal with the prescience topic, which becomes much more elucidated in the further books. The third Dune book, Children of Dune, 1976. So we're talking about 11 years after the original and 7 years after the second book. So already seeing there's a real gestation period here. He doesn't just churn out books and come up with the next topic and just write whatever. He really thinks about what he's doing here. Now, this is a book that is kind of a difficult transition period in the series because it's trying to get to where the fourth book can be, but it's not the first book, and it's already quite different from the second book. And so it's big, but some of the ideas are a little bit more vague than how nailed down they are in the second or in the fourth, and later on in the series when it comes to some conclusions and really ties some threads together. It's still good, and one of the things that makes it good is this compelling new set of characters, and some old characters exist but in a different sense, and so you experience them in a very different way, and that makes you, it sort of like recolors the way you think of what happened in the books before. And this new set of characters are very intriguing, and you can't quite tell who's going to get where and who's going to make it and what's going to happen at what point in time. Where's this? How's there going to be 3 more books in this series at this point in time? It seems like a very difficult question to answer. Obviously at the time we didn't know there'd be 3 more, and so it certainly has its own value, but of the 6, it's one of my least favourite, I have to say. I like all 6, so I could certainly read them all again. Now, the fourth book, God Emperor of Dune, 1981, it was published, 2 years before I was born. This is a masterpiece. Like, this book alone, if it wasn't for the fact that, unfortunately, to really appreciate it, you have to have read the books before, this, I would say, just take this out of the series and make this his book. Like, this is his Ulysses by James Joyce. Yeah, this is his book that's just his Alan Moore's Watchmen. This is the magnum opus, the ultimate piece of his extrusion of his philosophy, his amazing writing level at this point in time, because he's been writing for quite a long time. The sheer scale and scope of this book is mind-blowing to even think about now, and I've read it entirely and multiple times. I had many years to think about at this point. It was literally over a decade ago that I read it, maybe like 13, 14, I think it was maybe about 21 when I read this book. It's been so long, and it still, I can almost not believe a book like this exists, and is so ambitious, but then pulls it off and is so good. There are new characters in this book. New characters that in some way are an allusion to past characters or continue things from past characters, but the way they now appear to you in this book are completely new. And the reason they exist in this book, the grand thing they are building towards, you see some of it early on, but it's like a great movie. It's like The Prestige. You're seeing some parts of it and you think you can almost grasp the whole, but it's only as each piece falls into place that the bigger picture really becomes clear. And when you see the scale of that, and when you see what the intimation is, and what is actually coming towards you when you see the entire iceberg, including the part below the water, it's actually staggering. It's absolutely incredible. This is a book which really tackles huge questions of civilization and humanity and what it means to contemplate the future and what you can do within a life and what the meaning of certain actions are, and the concept, do the ends justify the means? And there's so much contained within this. This is a book where, again, the term space opera is unfortunately used too much. This is a space opera on an epic level. Now, sure, there are other fantasy series where things take place over thousands and millions of years, but a lot of those are more pulpy. They are a bit more hackneyed. Not everything hangs together as well. This is like a grand clock that every single piece is working in perfection and harmony and designed in a specific manner, and so the totality of it is immense, but the craftsmanship of each part is also incredible and really precise and well put together. The fifth book, now this is an interesting part as well, because if people drop out at Dune Messiah, people also drop out at Heretics of Dune. The fifth book, Heretics of Dune, 1984, a year after I was born. And the reason why people drop out of this book is because what happens in the fourth book is so monumental and so tied into the books before that the fifth book, in some senses, has to reset you a bit and take you somewhere else and deal with something else and other characters that initially it feels like you got the low, I've come off the high of that, and I wish that could have continued, but obviously it couldn't, and what else is there really to be told? And in a lot of series, this is where series fall down. When they start to introduce side characters that you don't care about as much, or the general themes of the original book aren't there as present. Now, that's not the case here. That's the key thing. There are tons of new characters here, and and factions and peoples you interacted with before, but you only interacted as an outsider from someone else's perspective. Now you're in with them. Your lot's tied in with them, and now you're seeing their worldview. And actually, this is where you really start to see just what an incredible writer Frank Herbert was, because the background of these aspects is, in its own way, incredibly compelling. And you almost forget about the past story. Now you're in this one, and you're seeing what's happening now from this new perspective and where these characters are going. And so this really fills in some of the background details of the other aspects of the universe, but in a really interesting way because of the new direction the story goes in, which is going to culminate in the 6th book. The last in the series, although it wouldn't have been, but I'll get to that. Chapter House Dune, 1985. This is a radically different perspective on the entire Dune universe and everything you knew before, and it retains one character from earlier books to provide a kind of through line, but he has changed so much and the universe has changed so much that in that sense you can identify with him because you've been present through all the books, but things have changed so much and you're different and he's different and you're seeing the world differently, and neither are you a certain way you're headed, and there's this new threat. And it's hard to see how it's going to be dealt with and what's going to happen with it. But the culmination is incredibly satisfying. I mean, I've always appreciated people who not only could make like dialogue fantastic and the story parts fantastic, but then even their endings, they're satisfying, not in as much as you knew what was happening. You didn't. But when they happen, it's only afterwards you realize, oh yeah, well, there's like a beauty to how that fit together, to the logical way you got there. And you know they didn't plan it the whole way. They had to freewheel it a bit, but then eventually they stuck the landing. That is a key aspect in fiction, because when you don't stick the landing, you can still be very good. It could be a flawed gem, could still be a great piece of work that had some very ambitious ideas and didn't make it. This sticks the landing. Now, with the context of that said, I will say at the end, there was supposed to be a 7th book of Dune. And unfortunately, Frank Herbert died before it came out. And in fact, based on what we know, it seems like there were very, very few notes. And as such, even though the 7th book of Dune was written by his son and a sci-fi writer who'd been involved with Star Wars novels, as far as I know, in the expanded universe, it's not really anything like Dune. And I'm very skeptical about how much it was exactly in those notes, you know. I mean, I'd be facetious when I see the quality of that guy's writing and say the notes were a piece of paper with typeface that said, 7th Dune novel. Dune begin, and then ... and then that's like wholly completed, because it feels almost like that, you know. So personally, I don't go beyond the 6 Dune books. I don't go into the Kevin Herbert stuff. I don't really explore those. Like I've tried a little bit, just wasn't for me. Like again, if someone made a sequel to a movie, but it wasn't the original director, it wasn't the original screenwriter, and it wasn't any of the original actors, I wouldn't really have any reason to watch it. Like I might watch it if it in itself seemed to have its own merit, but I wouldn't watch it just because I liked the other one. And so in the same sense, the other Dune books just aren't really for me. Now, one of the things about the Dune series is not only does it deal really well with a big scale, philosophical kind of questions of life, almost epistemology, etc. But there's also fantastic dialogue at times. Like, what's good about the Dune series is, at times it is quite slow moving, but in a manner where you actually prefer that it's like that, because it's so well told and the dialogue's so interesting and the character development's so interesting that you really feel like you're taking in all the details and you're getting a richer world as a result. It's not like those books. Like at times, I have to say, at times in A Song of Ice and Fire and at times in Lord of the Rings, the overarching plot might be great, or might have had a really great chapter, and then they'll go to like a side character or some smaller aspect, and it always feels like, kind of like in the show of Game of Thrones, where you're like, I'm not really that into this character that much. Like, I wish we could get back to that other one. Like, I can't wait to the next episode, the next chapter where that guy's back again, and then I can pick it up again, I'm back again. It doesn't really ever feel like that, the Dune series. That's why I think it took so long to craft it, and why it's such a unique series for me personally within fiction. Now, like A Song of Ice and Fire, one interesting aspect thematically of the series is the way the past constantly still has these ripple-like echoes through these reverberations through and informing the present of what's happening. So within Lord of the Rings, for example, you know when you're reading Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, you haven't read it about it yet, but there's the battle in the past of Sauron and Isildur and all that sort of stuff. And it's constantly intimated to, and you're getting details of it, and you're learning about why that's affecting the world now, but you don't have all that information. You're not there. That's not where the first book starts. Likewise, in A Song of Ice and Fire, obviously we have the whole thing with the Targaryens and Robert's uprising and all that. And the whole book, actually, the first book's massively informed by that. And obviously the overarching plot is as well. But you're never there. You never find out all the details initially. You're not reading that book. That's just a setup to inform this book now, because this is the book we're reading that's trying to tell you the story. So in that sense, the whole Butlerian jihad, where essentially it's removing certain types of modern technology that we would recognize from the universe and setting certain limitations on the universe as to how it can be explored, absolutely is what creates the Dune universe and sets up its own unique story, because obviously it is very advanced and it is very sci-fi, but at the same time it has these certain restrictions from which the creativity arises, because yes, we don't have the same technology. It's been reset to some degree. As a result, that's why spice, this drug base, is so important. And so is space travel is very different, because you don't have computing machines that can calculate in the same time. And then you get mentats, which obviously become very important in terms of the characters, even though they're initially ancillary characters, and you're wondering, how do they fit in? Oh, are they really just a human pretending to be a computer? No, there's something different to that, isn't it? Because a human would process things differently in their brain. And so it's very cool, it's really interesting, it's fascinating, but it's also integral to how the plot plays out. Now, an interesting detail not a lot of people will know, but obviously is quite interesting to me personally, because I am interested in the psychedelic world and that kind of creativity and art, is that apparently there was an impact of psychedelic use on the series, on some of the concepts, and on Frank Herbert himself. Because the mycologist Paul Stamets said, and I'll quote, Frank went on to tell me that much of the premise of Dune, the magic spice, spores, he put in brackets, mushroom spores, that allowed the bending of space, so brackets, tripping, the giant worms, maggots are digesting mushrooms, the eyes of the freeman, the cerulean blue of the psilocybe mushrooms, the mysticism of the female spiritual warriors, the Bene Gesserits, which apparently he considers influenced by the tales of Maria Sabina and the sacred mushroom cults of Mexico, came from his perception of the fungal life cycle and his imagination stimulated through his experience with the use of magic mushrooms. Now, even if that wasn't true, it's certainly a very interesting contrast drawn to it. And if it is true, I mean, as far as I know, I think I won't comment on that actually, but it certainly seems at the time he grew up in and the sort of intellectual person he was, I could believe he was someone involved with psychedelic use at some point in time, or it informed his experiences. And it's certainly a very interesting contrast point, even though you don't need to know that. It doesn't really affect the novels. And like I say, the sequels aren't really for me, but this series for me stands above and beyond all others. And it really is for me the golden series in fiction.